authors' meetings for the textbook you were reading, and we came to talk about Rome with one of our author teams, Steve Hirsch, being a specialist on the ancient world. The idea of comparing Rome with Han China seems like just about as good an idea as peanut butter and jelly. I mean, it just really fit, and it seems we probably have less of a debate over this chapter than any other. And I think that's probably a mistake. Like many ideas that are, really, really good on first inspection, they don't necessarily hold up. But it does raise the question as to why do the similarities, as you think about them more, not seem to be as salient as they first appeared, and what would have been a better comparison if you had determined that at some point, rather than having a sort of a tea party of different cultures, which we had in our earlier chapters, you wanted to have a direct comparison from two dramatically different cultural zones. I think I would probably now argue that a comparison between Greece in the period before Alexander the Great and the Zhou dynasty in China, that is, say, the dynasty before the Han, which was chaotic and divided into a lot of competing principalities, rather analogous in some way to the competing city-states of Greece, but also which gave rise to the culture that idolized Confucius, who lived, after all, in the supposedly born around 551 B.C.E. He's way before the Han dynasty, and therefore he is in the same time frame as the pre-Socratic philosophers, and then moving on with his disciples to the later Greek philosophers. In some ways, that now seems to me perhaps to have been a better comparison, and then let Iran and India be together without having those Greeks interloping on their Aryan purity. But then you'd have the question of what do you do with Rome? And of course, I've already raised the question in this class of how do you escape the Bible? A Bible in which there is comparatively little that is historically provable, that covers a comparatively small area, that isn't a terribly long text, but that nevertheless has been the source of endless images, moral examples, historical lessons, and so forth for the last 2,500 years. Rome has something of that same quality. That is to say, the temptation to look at Rome as a model of what happens in a country that engages in imperial expansion seems to be, irresistible. Whether it is Napoleon styling his empire on Rome's, or whether it is one of the Cassandras that we have around us in this country, saying that we're going to go the way of Rome and fall, or whether you have a classic work that nobody reads, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in which you think decline and fall, what a cool concept. And you actually think it's about Rome all the way through, whereas actually it starts rather late in the game. Rome is just always there. So you have to somehow carve out a special place for the Roman experience. The question is whether that place is within Europe and the Mediterranean and the Hellenistic world, because you could easily imagine writing a history of the Hellenistic world in which you would have a chapter that would combine the Greek kingdoms that followed Alexander, the kingdom of the Ptolemies in Egypt, or the kingdom of the Seleucids in Syria and Iraq, and for a while in Iran, and the kingdom of the Romans, which began, of course, as a kingdom and then became a republic and then became an empire. But in any case, it was clearly Hellenistic. There's no doubting that. The Romans slavishly copied Greek art. They performed Greek plays. They admired and extended the teachings of Greek philosophers. And they enslaved every Greek they could get their hands on. Not quite, but they had no particular respect for Greeks, but for everything that the Greeks had wrought, they had great respect. And one of the products of that, of course, is the fact that Romanization is not comparable to Hellenization. The territories that were Romanized were primarily parts of Europe that had never been influenced by the practices of the Greek world and had never been conquered by Alexander the Great. So that for Northern Europe, Northwestern Europe, and Southwestern Europe, Rome is truly the model, and you get Romanization. But wherever the Romans went as successors to the Greeks, as successors to the successors to Alexander, their language did not take root, and the culture that comes to be honored is not the Roman culture, but rather the culture of the Hellenes, who are being superseded politically, but not culturally or ideologically. So you could probably say what we need here is a chapter on Hellenization in the late ancient world that would take up the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and the Romans in a single chapter, and another chapter comparing the world of the Greek city-states with the chaotic, so-called feudal disputes that you had in pre-Han China. But that wasn't the way it seemed when we were setting up the table of contents. Instead, it seemed like Han, China, and Rome fit well together. And why was that the case? What made them seem alike? Well, because they happened at the same time. And it's amazing what synchrony will do to historians. They will say, oh, this happened here, and this happened here just at the same time. Wow, look at that. And then they'll, my favorite comparison is Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in Arabia is born in the same year as John Wesley in London. And I say, gee, that must be a sign of some sort. And so I write, an elaborate essay based on that, on trying to make sense out of that particular total coincidence. Because synchrony is a drug for historians, and they do get enmeshed in things that happen at the same time. So the Roman Empire, you go from the Punic Wars, where the Romans are really establishing their their hold outside of Italy by fighting against the Carthaginians, and that's right at the time of the beginning of the Han Dynasty in China, when, after the very brief tyrannical period of the Qin, you have this new long-lived dynasty that lasts until 221 CE. 221, a little early for the end of the Roman Empire, but on the other hand, if you just go 80 years later, you get the Emperor Diocletian, who splits the empire between East and West. And once it's split, I mean, who cares? Later Roman history just doesn't have the riveting quality as the story of the Republic and the transition to the empire. By the time you get past 300, or even past 250, you're mired down in barbarian invasions and efforts by a dizzying sequence of emperors to try and find some way to retain or hopefully re-establish some authority for the empire. So if you go from 200 BC to 200 AD, 200 BCE to 200 CE, you have the Han Dynasty, and if you take those same dates and you put them in Roman context, you're going from the Punic Wars down to the increasing impact of the Germanic invaders. And so you seem to have a nice synchrony. Then you have the synchrony of the fact that they're barbarians. And you say, well, that's cool because you have two empires. Each empire is beset by barbarians. And you read Chinese history, and you find that the Chinese term different peoples Western barbarians or Northern barbarians or Southern barbarians or Eastern barbarians. And then, particularly with the Eastern barbarians, like Korea and Japan, they eventually decide they're not barbarians once they adopt Chinese customs. But if you actually look at it in Chinese, you'll find that isn't the same word modified by directions. Those are different terms. It's the word barbarian that English translators have used to draw those words together. You could use the word foreigner just as well. But barbarian is what gets used. And the reason for this is primarily because the people whom the Chinese encountered on the north were pastoral nomads in Inner Asia. Let me say that I'll probably use the term Central Asia for the western portion of the Eurasian steppe, what today would be Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Inner Asia for areas still further to the east, Mongolia and Chinese provinces of Xinjiang and Gansu in the northwest of contemporary China. But the Chinese were facing pastoral nomadic adversaries in their northwest, most notably the Xiongnu, and the Romans were facing adversaries in their northeast who were, if not pastoral nomads, at least they were nomads, not as dependent upon horse culture as the later nomads that come in from the east. The Germans who are the primary migrating folk of the Roman period, don't fall into that category of steppe nomad exactly. But people will say, well, both empires were facing these nomadic pressures. And both empires built elaborate fortifications to protect their empire. In the case of the Chinese, it's the Great Wall, which actually comes into being in stages, but it certainly was intended as a barrier against nomads from the north. In Rome, you had the word limes, which was used for a fortified frontier. As it turns out, most of the fortifications were not against the nomads in the north, but rather against nomads in Algeria and Tunisia. Nevertheless, the whole idea of trying to wall out your enemy was shared between the two states. And then you look at the map, and you say, well, here we have the Eurasian landmass, and at the western end of it, we have a Roman Empire. The eastern end of it, we have a Chinese Empire. Or, if you're looking at it from your point of view, at the western end of it, you have the Romans, and the eastern end of it, you have the Chinese. And so then you can talk about the middle, and what is there? Is there something about their common foe that is defining? And of course, it became helpful when a French philologist said that Xiongnu was probably the origin of the word Hun, because the Huns attack the Romans only 400 years after the Xiongnu attacked the Chinese. And what's 400 years when you're dealing with Asian history? Nobody really accepts the Xiongnu-Han comparison today, so far as I can tell. At least they don't say that they're the same people. And in fact, it's not perfectly clear who the Huns were in any sort of ethnic or linguistic terms. So that for the Huns, who become an important part of Europe for a brief time in the 5th century, you have several personal names and 3 actual words that are known. On the basis of that, certain philologists have said, well, they must somehow be related to the Turks. There's primarily, if not primarily at least, eminent among them was Omelyan Pritsak, a specialist on Ukrainian history, who said, well, their language wasn't like the Turkic languages, it was more like Chuvash. And the thing is, with Pritsak, whom I knew, his test for anyone who knew language was this: do you know Chuvash? And because Chuvash, which is an obscure language spoken in Russia, was sort of the model of obscure languages, and Pritsak would always hold it over you whether or not you knew Chuvash. I have no idea whether Hunnic was related to Chuvash or not, but I would never doubt it. I just wouldn't bet the house on it. So you have a seemingly comparison of 2 empires against possibly a similar economic formation represented by inter-Asian and Central Asian nomads, whom you call barbarians. I should point out, as I mentioned before, that a barbarian is not originally a Latin term. It's a Greek term that refers to people who do not speak Greek. There are other languages in the world that have terms for sort of the unspeakable other. In Arabic, you use the word ajam. Sorry, there's an A on there. Which literally means people who don't speak Arabic. And the adjunct could be Spaniards or they could be Persians. It's the same as the barbaros in Greek. In ancient India, you use the word Mlecha. Mlecha, those were the people who weren't Indians. So that if you find yourself at a cocktail party and people are talking about Sanskrit words for the other, you'll know what that one is. But the point is that the idea of having a categorical term for the other was not peculiar to the Romans, and the notion of a barbarian was a fairly flexible one. Somewhat complex in the evolution of the flexibility. For example, the word only occurs once in the Iliad, or in all of Homer. And it occurs in the form of barbarophonos, which means having a language that sounds like bar, bar, bar. And apparently it was used to refer to allies of the Trojans who were the Carians, who spoke a language descended from Luvian, an old language of Anatolia, that the Greeks absolutely could not understand. And so Homer said, this is barbarophonos. It sounds like barbar. But at the time of Homer, talking about 800 BC, the idea that all non-Greeks are barbarians wasn't there. By the time you got to Aristotle, the notion that non-Greeks are barbarians and as such are natural slaves has come to be a fleeting Greek obsession, which is pretty much gone by the time the Romans take over in Greece and the Greeks themselves, in many instances, become slaves. So the Romans simply inherit this usage. The reduplicated syllable, barbar, it's always said that means because it sounds like a non-Greek language. Actually, I think it is more correct to say it sounds like an animal sound. I once made a very large collection of the sounds that animals make in different languages in the world. Who say, well, if we say a dog goes arf, arf, what does an Arab say? A dog goes hab, hab. What does a Korean say? A dog goes wong, wong. And through different species of animals, you have this variation around the world. That's quite substantial. I had in mind to write a children's book on the whole thing, but I figured that teaching 5-year-olds how Koreans say arf, arf probably wasn't going to sell. But the interesting thing was that the reduplication of syllables was the common practice. That when you have reduplicated syllables, the suggestion is that it's not human speech. And these animal sounds are actually quite interesting because you can't usually conjugate them. In other words, a dog does not arf arf. You say, oh, he arf arfed at me, or he arfed at me even, but rather he barked. So you have another tier of words that signify animals making sounds that are animal sounds, but they're not the actual sounds that you say if you were trying to imitate those animal sounds within the phonemic range of your particular language. And they're certainly not the animal sounds that you make if you were trying to imitate the animal. And here, of course, it's interesting that if a Korean or an Arab or an American tries to imitate, let's say, a dog barking, they will make the same sound. Something like that. But if they're trying to characterize it, then it has to be subjected to the phonemic array of possibilities within their particular languages. This wasn't on my program for today to talk about this, but it's very interesting, really. I think it has a lot to do with the origins of human speech. I think I think these animal sounds are pre-syntactic. That, you were out there and you wanted to say what was on the other side of the hill, and you didn't yet know how to say, there's a lion on the other side of the hill, and you roaring like a lion was one thing you could do, but then you could also say, roar, roar, or something like that. Anyhow, you have synchrony, you have the appearance of empire, you have the apparent geographical location at opposite ends of a great continuous stretch of territory from Eastern Europe across to northern China, and these seem to warrant a comparison. But then you say it's an empire. Well, in what sense? It's an empire. The Romans conquered everybody. And so if you say an empire is a powerful political state that subjects other peoples, originally independent, to their domination, and does so in through military or later economic means. Well, then Rome is sort of your paradigmatic empire. The Romans always denied it. Their idea was that they never fought an offensive war. They defended their borders all the way to Iran. And that was important to them because there was if you go back to the stories that Livy tells us about the Roman kingdom, you find that there was a class of priests called the Fetiales. And when you had a dispute with a neighbor, the people in the neighboring, from the neighboring town stole Publius's goat. The Fetiales would go to the border with that city-state or whatever, and they would yell across the border, "Y'all better return Publius's goat, or you're going to be in big trouble." And then they'd wait. And if Publius didn't get his goat back, they would go back and report that there had been a failure to compensate, to make amends for the aggression of the other side, and that therefore the gods would support a war. And it was important for the Romans that the gods were always on their side, and this is the way they guaranteed they were always on their side, was by construing every campaign they had as an act of defense. And then if by good luck they happened to conquer, and then they'd establish their border at some further point, and then defend that border until they could expand beyond it. So the Romans were expansive, and they were bureaucratized in a fashion that enabled them to accommodate different territories with different status levels as they expanded, so that what initially would be sort of recently conquered territory would down the road become closely allied and then become part of an expanded notion of Rome itself, until eventually, well into the period of the empire, all the people ruled by the Romans were declared to be citizens of Rome. So they were organized for conquest, both in the military sense, they were very effective, and in the sense that they had bureaucratic and political instruments for administering and eventually assimilating territories they conquered. But China was not an empire in that sense. The Han Dynasty did take over northern China, which had been unified by the short-lived Qin who preceded them. But they did not then perform prodigies of conquest. They remained pretty much where they were for their 4 centuries of existence. This was not a completely homogeneous territory. There were various peoples whom they regarded as non-Chinese, and we know very little about these people. We have their names and sometimes terms suggesting how this people was related to this other people, but basically we know very little about the neighbors of the Chinese, other than the Xiongnu that had an actual effective kingdom to the north of China up in the Inner Asia. But the Han, for example, did not expand into southern China. The division between northern China and southern China is the Yangtze River. It is a significant division, not simply because it is a major river, but because the military realities on the north side are very different from the military realities on the south side. On the north side, you have various rivers, but basically northern China is a plain, often called the North China Plain, very ingeniously, and it was very good for horse warfare. So the Han developed chariotry, they developed cavalry, they borrow the practices of the Inner Asian nomads, and that pattern of borrowing from Inner Asian nomads continues for centuries after the demise of the Han. So there's a very important linkage northward of a technological and military sort. But the area south of the Yangtze River, first the area around the river is marshy and not suitable for horse activities. And the area further south is much hillier than in the north. And basically the Han armies were not equipped to invade the south in the way that the Romans invaded everybody they knew. And in fact, the peoples of the south were able to use the river boundary as a protection. And ultimately, when you finally do have the northern Chinese states going to the south, a lot of it has to do with the development of naval forces on the Yangtze River because it is such a formidable geographical barrier. So China is not, under the Han, is not the great military expansive power that Rome is, and does not develop the same degree of bureaucratization that the Romans have. When you look back at the history of Chinese law and bureaucracy, or Chinese law and administration, you don't particularly look to the Han, although there are certain Confucian-inspired advisors who were very important as counselors to the Han rulers. But it is really for the Tang Dynasty that comes into being around 600 AD or 600 CE that becomes the model. So whereas in European history, Roman law becomes a model that existed in the Roman, or came into being in Roman times and ultimately is revived and made into an important foundation for modern European law. In China, the parallel of Roman law would be the Great Tang Law Code, which has nothing to do with the Han. It comes hundreds of years later, although starting around 600, it falls into the same period of the revival of Roman law. So Han doesn't have that kind of parallel. It doesn't lay down a system. For example, later on in China, you have an examination system by which people who work for the government must pass a series of examinations. This is not a Han practice. This is later Chinese history. So Han doesn't have that kind of paradigmatic place that Rome has for history in the West. And then there's another sort of interesting non-comparison. And it is one that has, to some degree, become put in the past by recent scholarship. But what originally amounted to was the argument that Rome was an economy built on slavery. And that, and this is going back to my what I've talked about in an earlier lecture about energy profiles, that human muscle power was the primary source of energy in Roman times. Slaves were not only abundant because of the wars, but they were discardable, more or less, in Roman law. You did not have to treat slaves in a humane fashion. China really didn't have slavery. I don't mean they didn't have slavery. There were slaves, but they were just as likely to be poor people who were became attached to a household as semi-members of the household, as they were anything else. You didn't have any notion, for example, that barbarians were natural slaves. There was no category of natural slaves in the Han period. Since the Han were not conquering and producing huge numbers of prisoners of war, you didn't have a massive supply of human labor. And yet China appears to have been quite well populated. There doesn't appear to have been a labor shortage. And one of the questions in Roman history has always been, what was the character of the labor supply in the ancient world? How would you get along without slavery? And eventually, the population that seems to be robust in the early Roman Empire, the population begins to shrink, and the successor states to Rome seem to be of a much more modest population size. And that is true of China as well. There is a census from the Han period that suggests that China under the Han had maybe 50 million people. And several hundred years later, there's another census that is less complete, doesn't cover the entire territory, but it comes in at about 16 million people, which has led historians to think that the chaotic conditions that followed the fall of the Han in the 3rd century CE led to a great shrinkage of the population, in the same way that the chaotic conditions of the late Roman Empire and then of the post-Roman situation in Europe led to a shrinkage of population there. But in the European case, the shrinkage of population is seen to have significant economic implications. This was a thesis put forward first, I think, by a French historian named Richard Lefebvre Desnoëttes. And his thesis was that in Rome, all significant work was done by slaves. After Rome fell, there was a shortage of labor. And this led people to invent new ways to use animals. And particularly it led the French to invent new ways to use animals, to harness them more efficiently. And according to Lefebvre Desnoëttes, this was the way in which France saved civilization. They pioneered a new concept of energy to take the place of the Roman slave economy. As far as farm labor went, as slaves become less numerous, farm workers come increasingly to fall in the category of serfs, who are so minimally distinguishable from slaves that it seems like a difference in terminology more than in substance. I'll talk about that at a later time. But Lefebvre Desnoëttes said that it was the fall in the population that led to this big technological change. What was the technological change? And here, I'm so happy someone asked that question because it's one that fascinates me. And this has to do with the way you utilize animal power. Now that's a cow, and if you are going to do something with that cow to make it work, you take advantage of the fact that its spinal process has some bones here that are much larger than the others and that stick up in a kind of a hump. Plus the fact that the cow is really interested in grass, and so it keeps its head down where the grass is. So all you have to do is put something up here. You can put it here, or you can tie it to the horns. You can tie it on here, or tie it on here, tie it on wherever you want. And then if you hook it to something back behind, let's say a plow, if you can get the cow to move forward, the plow will follow it and will dig a furrow in the ground. And this is where plowing came from. But in order to make it work, it was felt you had to have, as I mentioned before, two of these guys, and the beam went across the necks of both animals in a yoke. And what you had here was not something like that, but rather a beam that went up between the two animals. Now this was and remains an efficient way to harness bovine animals. All right. Then you have a horse. Now, your horse doesn't have a hump that's sticking up with all of this firm, bony substructure. So that if you put a a bar on top of a horse and then carry it over to the horse next to him, and you have something between them, something back here you want to pull, and they go forward, it falls on the ground because there's nothing to pull from. So in the Romans and the Greeks, the ancient Western world in general said, this is the only way we know of to harness two animals, and we have to have two. So how do we make it work for horses? What we do is we put on a strap here to hold it in place, but more importantly, we put on a strap here around the animal's neck. What Lefebvre Desnoëttes argued was, if you do this, and we have many, many, many images from ancient Greece and Rome showing precisely this way of harnessing, he said, if you do it, then the animal is not pulling with its bony structure, it's pulling with its neck muscles. And if he pulls too much, he strangles. So horses were not as strong as oxen to begin with, but if they had to have their labor determined by how tough their neck muscles were, because they didn't have a bony structure on which to rely in pulling, then horses would be rather inefficient. But for the Romans, they didn't care, according to Lefebvre Desnoëttes, because they had slaves. And therefore, they were perfectly willing to strangle their horses and use them for pulling lightweight chariots or other vehicles for the elite, and not use them for a lot of labor. And so the French came along, and they invented, what did they invent? According to Lefebvre Desnoëttes, they invented the horse collar, where you had a collar, horseshoe-shaped collar that went around the neck, and instead of having two animals, you had a chain or a strap on one side of the collar, a chain or strap on the other side of the collar, a connecting bar in the back, and then your plow was here. What this meant was that the force was transferred from the neck to the animal's shoulders, not from a hump, but rather from the shoulders behind the neck. And this invention of the horse collar was conceived of as multiplying the energy of animals and allowing society to recover tremendous amounts of labor that had been lost with the demise of the Roman slave population and the general shrinkage of population in Europe. So, though it was proved by later historians that the French did not invent this, it nevertheless was and remains a very important theory in the history of Europe. That is to say that you had a fundamental change in the use of animals for energy associated with new harnessing techniques. The dating of those techniques is debated. This is the primary technique, but there's one other that I won't go into. But where now do historians say the new techniques came from? They say they came from China. So you say, oh, well, isn't that convenient? The Chinese were losing population after the fall of the Han, so they must have had the same situation, and therefore, if the French didn't invent the horse collar, it's reasonable the Chinese did. Except that the Chinese invented it during the Han Dynasty rather than after. And it appears to have had nothing to do whatsoever with a abundance or a lack of manpower. it seems to have more to do with the ability of the Chinese to adapt technology without being captivated by the notion of animals operating in pairs. You find mixed animals. You have one in China. Going back to the Han, you'll have single animal harness, double animal harness, triple animal harness. I ran across one with 23 animals in harness, so that's a bit later. If anything, the whole story of harnessing focuses on the ideological rather than the economic fixation of the people in the West. So that raised a question as to whether Roman slavery really is that important when you look at the economy. Now, I've talked about in terms of harnessing and the horse collar. There is another argument that I will bring up in a few weeks having to do with the rise of water power. Again, sometimes attributed to the need for a different energy profile following the demise of the Roman slave economy. But the possibility that the slave economy really wasn't that crucial an element still is not investigated very much. So that when you have these two synchronized states, one in the West and one in the East, that both have strong economies, at least until they begin to decline, that both have robust populations. Is it that important that slavery is used in one and not in the other? And I'm not sure it is, but it's a very important theme for the history of slavery, which is primarily a theme in Western history. Now, you do in later Chinese history, if you come down to early modern period, have a certain amount of slavery. But if you were to teach a course in the world history of slavery, which could be a very interesting course, you really wouldn't get that much out of ancient East Asia. And it raises the question as to what is the real function of slavery or the real meaning of slavery within a society. Is it really an economic form, or is it a social and political category that is better seen in non-economic contexts? Now, what happens after the Romans and the Chinese sort of play out their period of imperial rule is again one of the things that seems to warrant treating them together, because the Roman Empire is succeeded, particularly in its western territories, by a whole chaotic group of principalities, kingdoms, duchies, etc., associated with the settlement and migration patterns of peoples speaking Germanic languages. This new population element not only changes the demography of Europe, but it changes the political complexion as well, and perhaps even more profoundly. It takes, let's say, if the Roman Empire falls in its declining days in the mid-400s, and Europe begins to get its act back together around 800, when you have Charlemagne declaring himself emperor, crowning himself emperor in Rome. Then you have something like 4 centuries of kind of bad news. at least from the point of view of anyone who wants to follow a linear political narrative. In China, you get about 4 centuries. The Han fall in the early 200s. The Tang reunify, or rather the Sui. The Tang, just as the Han followed a brief, a short-lived empire known as the Qin, the Sui were a short-lived reunifying state that preceded the Tang. So you have about 400 years between the end of the Han and the Sui-Tang reunification of northern China. In Europe, this was for many generations referred to as the Dark Ages, a period that either was not known or who cared, because it was no longer Rome. Rome was the big story, and these petty states came later, were of much less significance until you begin to get some sort of a glimmer of a restoration of Rome, with Charlemagne declaring himself an emperor. In China, this is a period of a substantial number of small states. It's sometimes called the Six Dynasties period, because there was a historian in the Tang who wrote a book based on one capital city in southern China, what is now the city of Nanjing, in which there was a succession of 6 ruling dynasties. So it becomes a 6 dynasty period. Somebody else writes a history and says this is the period of the 3 kingdoms, and looks at from another perspective and sees a different sequence of things. But in any case, you have on both ends, the end of the highly organized state is followed by disunity and competition among various claimants to power. And the economic circumstances are such that you, as I said, seem to have a substantial decline in the population of the area that had been under Roman authority in Europe and the area under Han authority in China. And in both cases, this interval lasts about 400 years. Now, what is interesting, in a sense, when you look at this, whether you call it the Dark Ages or you call it the 6th Dynasty period, is that you have a dynamic new religion spreading. Christianity begins, of course, in the 1st century CE. It sort of defines the 1st century CE in the old terminology, in the Roman Empire. And Buddhism begins to show up in China in the 1st century CE under the Han. In both cases, it is the period after the decline of the state, and indeed after the final demise of the state, that has the largest expansion of the new religion. So that when Rome comes to an end in the second half of the 400s, Christianity still is not really that deeply implanted. Now, I know that with Constantine, in the early 300s, you have Christianity made the official religion of the Roman Empire, but that primarily applied to the East. The most heavily Christianized areas were what we now would refer to as Greece, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, and Tunisia, to some degree Iraq, and I'm using here Syria in the sort of macro Syrian sense that's beloved of the Asad family in Syria, to include what is now Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. That's where the Christians were, and in Italy, and maybe in southern Gaul, and some in Spain, but most of the Christians who later become the heart of Christendom in the West, the Christians of Northern Europe, the British Isles, Germany, and heaven knows, Poland, these people are not Christians at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. So that it is the late empire that sees the spread of Christianity, and even more the post-empire. And the same thing in China. Buddhism is not a big deal for the Han, but under the 6 dynasties and the 3 kingdoms, Buddhism becomes a powerful, popular religious faith, and the Sui Tang period is marked by the dominance of Buddhism. So again, this is one of these tempting synchronicities. Is there a meaning to this? Now, those people who would argue for a meaning would probably associate the meaning with a personalization of the notion of faith and salvation. In other words, when you had a state that had institutionalized religious forms that relied upon the role of the emperor or his minions acting on behalf of the people for formal rituals involving the, at least nominally involving everyone, then when that state falls, and when the emperor and his minions are scattered in flight, then what is left of religion? The Roman temples, and particularly those temples dedicated to Roman emperors who declared themselves to be gods, become less and less appealing, it would seem, as centers for religious faith with the decline of the empire. And similarly, to have the emperor sacrifice on behalf of the entire people in the period of the Han, or to have his governors or other officials conduct public sacrifices on behalf of the people, perhaps became less and less appealing in the post-Han period, with Buddhism as an alternative. Now, this is not to say that Christianity and Buddhism were in any way identical in the ways in which they appealed to people as personal, as ways of personally expressing a faith. Christianity was salvational, and initially based on the notion that Christians could, work miracles and heal people and things like that. Buddhism was based on the idea of withdrawal and escape from the inevitable pains of the world, and go through a sequence of reincarnation until ultimate cessation of the cycle of reincarnation was achieved, whether you call it nirvana or moksha or whatever. So they were different, but they departed quite a bit from the notion that the ruler was acting spiritually on behalf of the people. So it may be that there's an important similarity there. But it also gets into the question of, besides public sacrifices and rituals carried out by the ruler, or carried out in temples that are established by and recognized by the empire, was there a philosophical change? And here you get the final comparison that I'll mention at this point, and that is the degree to which Rome and Han China were centers of or places where philosophy and government came together in a fruitful and harmonious fashion. On the Roman side, this is primarily related to Stoicism, with a less important, from a governing point of view, philosophy of Epicureanism. And on the Chinese side, this was the spread of Confucianism. Stoicism maintained that that doing one's duty, particularly if you were a state official and you had a post that you were supposed to be filling, that was a moral and philosophical obligation, even though it inevitably was going to make you feel bad. You just sucked it up, and you did what you were supposed to do. More similar, perhaps, to some of the doctrines that you have in India in the Bhagavad Gita with the notion of Dharma than you would have in China. But it was important philosophy. It was a philosophy that was espoused at the level of emperors, so that Marcus Aurelius, one of the better emperors, is a known Stoic philosopher, but also trickled down to lower levels of the population. The Epicureans had a different view of things. They accepted the Stoic notion that, life really is pretty awful. But they said the objective of life should not be to sort of cowboy up and get through your duty, but rather you should elect to remain by the side of the road and not take on the duties of state, not take on the duties of high office, but to live with as little emotional involvement and commitment as you can, because emotional commitment is always going to turn sour, and hang out with some similarly epicene friends and have dinner together and get drunk and play the lute and just not involve yourself, and then eventually you will die and you won't be reborn, and it's we'll get through it. It was not a hedonistic philosophy, but it was a philosophy of removal from society. On the Chinese side, you had Confucianism. Confucius, as I say, being a thinker who lived in the 6th century, born in the 6th century B.C.E., who had many followers and who expanded on his doctrines. And he was known for short anecdotal statements or descriptions of his behavior, a form later on we'll find with the Prophet Muhammad, that were taken as guides by his followers. And those, again and again, repeated the notion that there are bonds of duty that the ruler has to the subject has to the ruler, the father has to the wife, or the wife has to the husband to the wife to the husband, the father to the children to the father, the older brother to the younger brother to the older brother, and the minister of state to the emperor, and the emperor to the minister of state. And you were supposed to recognize these forms of obligation and live by these forms of obligation if you were going to lead a proper life. And one of the forms of obligation, of course, was to serve the emperor in the office to which you were appointed. And this is very similar to the Stoic view. And indeed, the Confucian doctrine raised the issue of what does the minister do if the emperor is a vicious tyrant? And the Confucian answer was, you remonstrate. You go to him and you say, you, sir, are a vicious tyrant. Now stop that. And then, if he says no, then you resign your job. But you do not revolt, because you've done your duty. Your duty is to remonstrate, to frankly say what you see is wrong, and if the emperor will not accommodate it, you now should leave the stage. And then the assumption was that within the family, within the imperial family, there would be family members who would, take the emperor out back and cut his head off and replace him with a better person. But you were bound by your duty, and your duty did not involve overturning the state or rebelling or anything of that sort. And this is quite Stoic in its character. Now, there was another philosophy that competed with it, which was Taoism, which was rather like the philosophy of Epicurus. It called for people to withdraw from the high traffic lanes of the imperial highway, and to stay by the side of the road and lead peaceful and uninvolved lives. So you had two notions of the relation of the individual to the public or to the governing style or the governing enterprise in these two empires. One of them was to become involved and to faithfully fulfill your duties. The other one was to withdraw and sit by the side of the road and enjoy a long life like the proverbial tortoise. And against these, in each case, you have a new religion coming along that says something dramatically different. Christianity on the one end and Buddhism on the other. At this university, we have a retired professor who teaches more than anyone else at the university. His name is Theodore de Berry. He was once the provost of this university. He was a provost when I came here 35 years ago. And he is one of the paramount Neo-Confucian thinkers in the world. He's written a zillion books. He regards the core curriculum as sort of something that he invented, and he's almost old enough to have done it. He's over 90, still teaching about 4 courses a semester. He is he kind of exemplifies this Confucian outlook on the world. And it comes to mind because I think his favorite saying of Confucius, of the Analects, is in Book 2, number 4. I've heard him talk about this many times. It's Confucius' autobiography. And he says, the master said, because these were repeated, stories told by his disciples. The master said, at 15, I had my mind bent on learning. At 30, I had become established. At 40, I had no doubts, or I was no longer perplexed. At 50, I knew what is ordained by heaven. At 60, my ear was an obedient organ for the reception of truth. At 70, I could follow what my heart desired without transgressing what was right. And Barry always gives this as, what the proper Confucian life should be. And I cite it now because I'll be 70 in a couple of weeks. And I've been thinking about this. Anyway, that's all for today.